The firefighters responding to the three-alarm blaze on Westbridge Road that December night thought they were racing to save a life. Instead, they discovered Rebecca Thulin's body in the master bedroom of the colonial she'd won just 4 months earlier in a vicious divorce. The house she'd fought ruthlessly to steal from her ex-husband Kenneth had become her tomb. When investigators found evidence of arson gone wrong, they uncovered the ultimate irony. Rebecca had died trying to frame Kenneth for a crime he couldn't have committed. He was 500 miles away when his ex-wife's revenge literally backfired. Chapter 1. The House That Love Built, Then Destroyed. The colonial of 4827, Westbridge Road in Novi, Michigan stood as a testament to what money and determination could build, even if love couldn't sustain it. Kenneth and Rebecca Thulin had chosen the lot themselves in the spring of 2003, walking through the muddy construction site with their twin daughters, Melissa and Madison, then only 5 years old. Rebecca had insisted on the corner lot, the one with mature oak trees that would shade the master bedroom in summer. Kenneth had wanted the practical features, the 3-car garage for his growing collection of vintage motorcycles, the finished basement where he could set up his workshop. They'd gotten both, pouring their dreams and Kenneth's inheritance from his father into every custom detail. The house had witnessed the full arc of their marriage. The early years when Kenneth's automotive parts business thrived and Rebecca hosted elaborate dinner parties for potential clients in the formal dining room. The middle years when the twins excelled at Birmingham Academy, their honor roll certificates and swim team trophies filling the built-in shelves Kenneth had installed in the family room. Even the later years, when silence replaced conversation at the granite kitchen island, the house maintained its dignity, its perfectly maintained exterior hiding the decay within. By 2017, the Thulins' marriage existed only on paper. Kenneth spent most nights in his basement workshop, the whir of power tools drowning out the reality upstairs. Rebecca had retreated to the master suite, transforming it into her personal domain where she consumed wine and social media in equal measures, crafting a fictional narrative of marital bliss for her 3,000 Instagram followers. The twins, now at Michigan State University, returned home less frequently, sensing the toxic atmosphere that had replaced their childhood warmth. The divorce filing in January 2018 surprised no one except Rebecca. She'd convinced herself that Kenneth would never leave, that his Catholic upbringing and fear of financial loss would keep him tethered to their hollow union. When the process server handed her the papers on a Tuesday morning, still in her silk pajamas at noon, her first thought wasn't heartbreak, but strategy. She immediately called Patricia Vance, the most ruthless divorce attorney in Oakland County, a woman whose reputation for destroying husbands was legendary. What followed was 8 months of legal warfare that would have impressed military strategists. Rebecca's attorney systematically dismantled Kenneth's character, painting him as an absent father who preferred motorcycles to his daughter's milestones. They presented receipts showing Kenneth had spent $40,000 on bike restorations while Rebecca struggled to pay for the twins' college textbooks, conveniently omitting that Rebecca had access to all their accounts and had actually spent twice that amount on jewelry and cosmetic procedures. The house became the central battleground. Rebecca's attorney argued she needed the stability of remaining in the family home, that her part-time work as a yoga instructor couldn't possibly support her finding suitable housing. They emphasized her role as the primary caretaker, the one who'd sacrificed her career as a marketing executive to raise their daughters. Kenneth's lawyer countered with evidence of Rebecca's affairs, 3 that they could prove, and her systematic draining of retirement accounts for personal spending. Judge Catherine Morrison's final ruling in August shocked Kenneth's attorney, but not Kenneth himself. Despite contributing 80% of the home's value through his inheritance and business income, despite evidence of Rebecca's financial manipulation and infidelity, the house went to Rebecca. The judge cited Michigan's equitable distribution laws and Rebecca's economic disadvantage from her years as a homemaker. Kenneth received his motorcycle collection and workshop tools. Rebecca got the 4,000-square-foot monument to their failed marriage, along with a modest alimony payment that would barely cover the property taxes. Chapter 2. 4 months of vengeful residence. Rebecca Thulin's victory in court should have tasted sweeter than the champagne she'd opened that August evening. Alone in the house, she'd fought so viciously to win. Instead, as she wandered through the empty rooms where Kenneth's presence still lingered like smoke after a fire, she found herself consumed not with satisfaction, but with enrage that seemed to feed on itself. The house felt less like a prize and more like a mausoleum, every corner holding memories of a life that no longer existed. The transformation began subtly. First, she removed every trace of Kenneth's existence from the common areas. Photographs from family vacations disappeared into boxes. His favorite leather chair was dragged to the curb for garbage pickup. The vintage movie posters he'd collected over 20 years were sold on eBay for a fraction of their value. But these actions brought no relief. If anything, the empty spaces seemed to mock her, highlighting not what she'd won, but what she'd lost. By September, Rebecca's behavior had shifted from bitter to vindictive. She discovered that Kenneth had rented a modest apartment in Farmington Hills, only 15 minutes away, and began driving past it at odd hours. She photographed his motorcycle in the parking lot, noted when lights went on and off, documented any female visitors, though there were none. She created fake social media profiles to monitor his activity, screenshot every post, every comment, building a dossier of his new life that she studied with the intensity of a detective working a cold case. The harassment escalated gradually, like water heating toward a boil. It started with late-night phone calls from blocked numbers, silence on the other end, just breathing. Then came the pizza deliveries Kenneth never ordered, sent to his apartment at 2 in the morning. Magazine subscriptions he never requested began flooding his mailbox. She signed him up for embarrassing mailing lists, had religious missionaries show up at his door, scheduled multiple contractor consultations at his workplace for services he didn't need. Kenneth initially tried to ignore the provocations, hoping Rebecca would exhaust herself and move on. But when she began showing up at his office, telling his colleagues fabricated stories about their marriage, suggesting he had hidden assets and secret girlfriends, he finally sought legal protection. The personal protection order he filed in October detailed 17 separate incidents of harassment, including Rebecca following him to client meetings and leaving threatening notes on his motorcycle. Rebecca's response to the restraining order was to escalate further. She filed a false police report claiming Kenneth had broken into the house and stolen valuable jewelry, pieces she'd actually sold months earlier to pay her attorney. When security footage from neighbors proved Kenneth hadn't been near the property, she claimed he must have hired someone. She called Child Protective Services with anonymous tips that Kenneth was dealing drugs from his apartment, forcing him to endure a humiliating investigation that found nothing. The house itself became a weapon in her campaign. She stopped maintaining the property, letting the lawn grow wild and the gutters overflow, then reported to the city that Kenneth was violating property maintenance codes, even though the deed was entirely in her name. She changed the locks repeatedly, even though Kenneth had no legal right to enter, spending hundreds of dollars on increasingly elaborate security systems while telling neighbors she feared for her life from her violent ex-husband. Inside the master bedroom, Rebecca spent hours crafting her most elaborate scheme yet. She researched insurance fraud cases on her laptop, careful to use private browsing modes she believed would hide her tracks. She studied how house fires spread, what accelerants burned cleanest, how investigators determined arson versus accidents. Her journal, hidden in a hollowed-out book on the nightstand, contained detailed notes about Kenneth's work schedule, his habits, the route he took to visit the twins at college. The plan crystallized in early December. She would burn the house down, making it appear that Kenneth had done it for revenge. She'd already established a paper trail of his supposed threats, his violations of the restraining order she'd fabricated. The insurance payout would be substantial. She'd quietly increased the coverage in November, telling the agent she worried about Kenneth's mental state. She practiced her victim narrative, the terrorized ex-wife who'd lost everything to a vindictive man who couldn't accept that she'd won their marital home. The December night she chose would be perfect. Kenneth would be 500 miles away at his daughter Madison's winter formal at Michigan State, but she'd make sure evidence pointed directly at him. Chapter 3. The night the plan backfired. December 18th, arrived with the kind of bitter cold that made even seasoned Michigan residents huddle indoors. Rebecca Thulin watched the weather forecast with satisfaction. The predicted snowstorm would provide perfect cover for her movements, while the harsh winds would help spread the flames quickly once they started. She confirmed through her fake social media accounts that Kenneth had indeed arrived at Michigan State for Madison's winter formal, posting photos with both twins at a pre-event dinner. 500 miles and dozens of witnesses would place him far from the scene of the crime she was about to stage. The preparation began at 4 in the afternoon, methodical and precise. Rebecca had purchased the accelerants over 3 weeks from different stores across 2 counties, paying cash while wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap that she believed would obscure her identity from security cameras. 2 gallons of paint thinner from a hardware store in Canton. 3 gallons of gasoline from various stations, stored in containers she'd bought separately. A bottle of lighter fluid from a camping supply store in Ann Arbor. She'd even bought painting supplies and camping equipment to justify the purchases, items she immediately donated to Goodwill, keeping only the receipts. She dressed carefully in clothes she planned to report as stolen. Kenneth's old University of Michigan sweatshirt she'd kept hidden, work boots similar to ones he owned, even a Detroit Tigers cap she'd bought in his size. The security system she'd installed recorded her leaving the house at 6:30, dressed in her normal yoga attire, supposedly heading to an evening class at the studio where she worked. What the cameras didn't capture was her return through the back garden 20 minutes later, having changed clothes and her car parked 2 streets over. The house felt different in the darkness, shadows stretching across walls that would soon cease to exist. Rebecca moved through the rooms with purpose, creating what she believed would be a convincing pattern of forced entry and arson. She broke the basement window from the outside using a crowbar, leaving the tool, purchased with cash months ago, near the window. She tracked mud through the basement in the oversized boots, creating footprints that would suggest a man's gait. Every detail had been considered, every piece of evidence crafted to point toward Kenneth. In the garage, she began soaking strategic areas with gasoline. The storage area where she'd placed boxes of Kenneth's supposed belongings he'd been demanding she return. The workbench where she'd scattered some of his old tools she'd hidden from the divorce settlement. The paint thinner went along the basement stairs, creating what she imagined would be a perfect trail of evidence, showing someone had entered through the broken window and spread accelerant upward into the house. The fatal mistake came from her impatience and the bitter cold. The garage, unheated and poorly ventilated, had become a container for invisible vapors. As Rebecca worked, the fumes accumulated, heavier than air, pooling around her feet and rising slowly like an invisible flood. The paint thinner she'd used liberally in the basement had also created vapors that crept upward through the floor vents. The house had become a bomb waiting for a spark. She moved to the kitchen, splashing lighter fluid across the curtains and along the baseboards, her movements becoming slightly uncoordinated from the fume exposure she didn't recognize. The plan called for starting the fire in the garage, allowing her time to escape through the front door while flames spread from the back of the house. She would then drive to her yoga class, arriving late, but with an alibi, discovering the tragedy only when police called her cell phone. At 8:47, Rebecca stood in the doorway between the kitchen and garage, the matchbook from Kenneth's favorite restaurant in her gloved hand. Another piece of planted evidence. She struck the match with a steady hand, ready to toss it into the garage and run. But chemistry and physics had their own plans. The invisible cloud of vapors didn't wait for the match to land. The flame met the fumes in the air, and the explosion was instantaneous. The blast threw Rebecca backward into the kitchen, the fireball following her through the doorway. Her carefully styled hair ignited immediately, the synthetic fibers of Kenneth's sweatshirt melting into her skin. She screamed, stumbling toward the front door, but the explosion had blown out the windows, creating a wind tunnel that fed the flames with fresh oxygen. The fire spread with impossible speed, racing along the trails of accelerant she'd so carefully laid, cutting off her escape routes one by one. Chapter 4. Evidence from the ashes. The first firefighters arrived at 8:53, just 6 minutes after the explosion rattled windows 3 blocks away. Captain Thomas Rodriguez of the Novi Fire Department had responded to hundreds of house fires in his 22-year career, but the intensity of the blaze at 4827 Westbridge Road immediately raised his suspicions. The heat signature visible through the thermal imaging camera showed multiple points of origin, patterns that suggested accelerant used rather than a natural fire spread. Even as his crew fought to contain the inferno, Rodriguez had already begun mentally composing his report recommending an arson investigation. Rebecca Thulin's body was discovered at 12:37 a.m. after the fire had finally been subdued and the structure deemed safe enough to search. She was found in the master bedroom, having somehow made it upstairs despite her injuries, perhaps driven by pure adrenaline and the instinct to reach what she considered her sanctuary. The medical examiner would later determine she died from a combination of severe burns and smoke inhalation, her lungs filled with soot and superheated gases. What investigators found clutched in her burned hand would become the first piece of a puzzle that would take weeks to fully assemble. A partially melted cell phone with an unsent text message to her attorney. He did it just like I said he would. Detective Michael Brennan, no relation to Kenneth, from the Novi Police Department's Major Crimes Unit arrived at dawn, the scene still smoldering and reeking of burned chemicals. His first priority was establishing Kenneth Thulin's whereabouts. A single phone call to Michigan State University's security office confirmed what would become an unshakable alibi. Kenneth had been photographed by event photographers at his daughter's winter formal from 7 p.m. until well past midnight. Timestamped credit card receipts showed him purchasing drinks at the venue bar at 8:15, 8:45, and 9:20. Dozens of witnesses, including university staff and other parents, confirmed his presence throughout the evening. The investigation took a dramatic turn when Detective Brennan obtained a warrant for Rebecca's financial records. On December 3rd, she'd increased the home's insurance coverage from $300,000 to $500,000, claiming she wanted protection after recent threats from her ex-husband. The insurance company's recorded call captured Rebecca describing elaborate scenarios of harassment, none of which had been reported to police until after she'd changed the coverage. The agent had noted the unusual request, but processed it anyway. The increased premiums paid in full from Rebecca's account. Security footage became the investigation's backbone. Working backward from the night of the fire, Detective Brennan's team painstakingly collected video from 27 different businesses where Rebecca had made purchases. The Home Depot in Canton showed her buying paint thinner on November 28th, wearing sunglasses indoors and a baseball cap pulled low. A Shell station in Plymouth captured her filling multiple gas containers on December 2nd, her license plate clearly visible despite her attempt to park at the edge of the camera's range. At Dunham Sports in Ann Arbor, she'd purchased camping supplies including lighter fluid, the same brand investigators found residue of throughout the house. The digital forensics team, led by specialist Jennifer Chun, discovered that Rebecca had attempted to create false evidence of Kenneth's threats. She'd sent emails to herself from anonymous accounts, all traced back to IP addresses matching her laptop or phone. She'd used voice-changing apps to leave threatening voicemails on her own phone, recordings she'd saved and played for neighbors to garner sympathy. Most damning, her laptop's search history, recovered from automated cloud backups she didn't know existed, showed months of research into arson methods, insurance fraud cases, and specifically, how to frame someone for attempted murder. The journal found in Rebecca's nightstand, partially damaged by water from the fire hoses, provided a chilling narrative of premeditation. Written in her distinctive handwriting, entries dating back to September detailed not just her plan, but her motivation. A toxic mixture of rage, greed, and a pathological need to destroy Kenneth even after winning the house. One entry from December 10th read, "He thinks he's safe in his pathetic apartment. When this house burns, everyone will know what kind of monster he really is. The insurance money will be my compensation for 15 years of misery." Fire investigator Sarah Martinez's report, submitted 3 weeks after the incident, conclusively determined that Rebecca had died from her own arson attempt. The explosion pattern, the accelerant distribution, and the point of ignition all indicated someone inside the house had triggered the fire, not an intruder. The broken basement window showed no signs of actual entry. No disturbed dust on the sill, no fibers caught on the glass edges. The footprints in the basement matched boots found partially melted in Rebecca's closet. Men's size 10 boots she'd purchased, but Kenneth wore size 11. Every piece of staged evidence ultimately pointed back to Rebecca herself, a frame-up job that had become her funeral pyre. Rebecca Thulin spent 4 months plotting the perfect revenge, only to become the sole victim of her own hatred. Kenneth rebuilt his life with his daughters by his side, while the house on Westbridge Road stood as a blackened reminder that sometimes vengeance truly does burn those who seek it most.